Hi everyone, I'm Candace Bryson and I am native to the Headland area. I did graduate from Headland High back a long time ago in 1995. I went off then to, oh I know, long time ago to me, but I then went on to the University of Alabama, where I graduated with a degree in anthropology. Did that back in 2000, and then I moved on to, I moved out west and lived out there for many years, Utah, Arizona, Nevada, all in those areas doing my archaeological work. I chose to focus on the prehistoric aspect of archaeology, specifically the Native American aspect of it. And eventually, my work brought me back to the South, which I was very happy about because all of my family is still here. And I opted then to continue my education, but I did so actually still with Arizona State University. I earned a master's degree in history with them, and I then continued on and am working on my PhD right now with Arizona State, and it's in history also, except I'm choosing to focus on World War II studies. So a little bit of difference, but at the same time, I'm still doing the prehistoric Native American work. Some of the artifacts that you see here are actually part of an exhibit that I'm creating that will be hopefully tentatively launched in November, and that will be done through Landmark Park out of Dothan, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. I spoke with Miss Dell, it was actually last year that I was supposed to come to the festival, and COVID kind of interfered with all of that. But she asked if I would come speak to you guys, and what I chose to talk on actually is one of the things I am very passionate about, which is the Native American prehistory of our state, because so many don't realize how diverse and actually how much of an influence was actually here. And throughout, and that's what that is just showing, is just an artist's rendition of what we thought it may have looked like. But the basic Native American we know is been divided up into the 5 tribes, which is Creek Nation, the Cherokee, the Chickasaw, the Choctaw, and the Seminole. The biggest representation that we have comes from the Creek, but when I'm focusing on my part of it, the tribes really don't play into it, because everything I focus on is all before we had any written record whatsoever. So everything we find has to be based on the artifacts that we locate. And there are 4 basic eras that we use to represent the prehistory of the Native Americans in North America. That's the Paleo Indian, and it's roughly 15,000 to 10,500 years before now. We do have a pretty good representation of that here in Alabama. It's not quite to the 15,000 year range. It's kind of closer to about, with us, about 12,000 years before now. And then we go to the archaic. The archaic is where we see the vast majority of the artifacts that we find, because it was just a huge population explosion at that time. It was, as you can see, around 10,000 to 3,000 years before now. And then the woodland, you start getting into a more modern sense of the Native Americans. And it was the 1000 BC to 1000 AD. And then the final one that we actually study for the prehistoric aspect of it is the Mississippian. And that was 1000 to 1550 or 1550 AD. So if we look at the Paleo, what we see as far as coming to Alabama is it was towards the end of the last ice age, and the glaciers are melting, and it's allowing everybody to actually get across all of those barriers of ice, and they start making their way down here. And they're all nomadic. They are just following the food is what they're doing. And most of the surviving artifacts that we have from that period, they're going to be your typical stone tools, like these, and then the bone tools that we tend to find. We know that in this area we had the large game such as the mastodons. We did have those, but what we see evidence of is that there was little interaction with those ancient mammals, I guess, with those ancient game, because they arrived when those were actually beginning to go extinct. So what we see a lot of is the deer, the rabbit, and then a very rudimentary style of fishing. The points that make this particular era what they are, and you'll know that it's from the Paleo period because all of them are going to have that fluted type of a base to it, and that was just so that they could hollow that out and attach the spear to it and wrap it around. That's a significant find of the Paleo period that we know that's that period specifically. There was no pottery development yet. They had not made it to that stage. The housing was all these brush type huts, kind of like those right there. It was just something that they could literally throw together until they moved on to the next, to their next stop for food. We do not really see much social interaction as far as the development of burial practices. We don't really see that yet. Again, no pottery has been developed at this time. That moves on, and that's just basic showing of how they would use the spear to get to the game. And to create the tools is called flint knapping. I'm sure most of you know about flint knapping and how the process of making it. I am horrible at trying to flint knap. I would not have made it in the tribe. They would have put me on some other duty because I could not make a tool. I've tried. It's not easy at all. But that leads us up to the archaic. It was not an overnight evolution into this period, I guess is the word to say. It began to change. The climate became much more stable in this area, and it's actually much closer to what it is now for us in Alabama. And their patterns began to become less nomadic. They began to develop these large social structures called bands, where it would be roughly 25 to 50 people. We see that they started to rely on hickory nuts, blackberries, muscadines, the chestnuts, actually a lot of things that we rely on today. Their game began to become smaller: rabbits, turkey, snake, turtle. We see that they began to develop settlements along waterways much more than we saw with the Paleo. This is the era that we actually see pottery being developed. So their technology and their ability to adapt is becoming so much greater. The projectile points actually become notched and they become smaller so that they can attach it more securely to the spear. And then we start to see the development of canoes. They're actually going to start using the waterways now for trade, for fishing. And the actual first evidence of pottery that we have in Alabama was around 1500 BC, so roughly 3,500 years ago for us. The populations are starting to grow, and here we're actually now seeing where they are beginning to develop burial practices. They're starting to have a realization of something greater than themselves and honoring the dead and moving forward to develop more of a social structure that we are used to seeing with them now, or with all of us now. The housing, the habitats are going to change a little bit. They're going to start to become more permanent with the use of skin hides versus just the brush that we saw with the paleo. And this is just a depiction. The settlements, as you can see in this picture, showing that they're actually beginning to grow. They're not moving around as much. They're relying on the fishing more. And just more illustrations. And it was actually during this period that they began to develop the axes, such as this one. And they began to develop even smaller ones that they would use to use in woodwork. We actually began to see that. And when you get to the woodland stage, which is the beginning of it was a little over 2,000 years ago, and even went into as late as 1000 AD. Here you begin to have a massive population explosion. It's not almost, well, literally almost overnight, the populations just grew. And no longer are they out hunting or following the game to hunt, they're sedentary. We're now going to start seeing the development of horticulture, and the bow and arrow use became extensive. Their settlement patterns changed completely. They began to develop mortuary practices. They now have developed base camps. As I said with archaic, they began to slow down on the hunting and the gathering, but they really did during the woodland. We have the development of large complexes. I'm sure most of you are familiar with the mound works throughout Alabama and Georgia and Mississippi. It was most of these mound works, these earthworks began in this period. It wasn't until the Mississippian that they actually perfected it, but it all began during this one. And the one particular that sticks out as far as being a woodland complex is the Hopewell in Ohio. It's a gorgeous and just stunning, intricate earthworks that they do. The mounds, I don't know how they did it personally. I could not have. But then as the populations increased, here is where we actually see the first sign of warfare. We didn't really see too much evidence of that, not to say that it couldn't have happened during the archaic period, but the evidence that we have, at least here in Alabama, of the first warfare was during this particular period, and that was because the resources were beginning to become scarce. They were now wanting to segment themselves off into how we now see the tribes today, into the modern day tribes. And with this period, the projectile points, as you'll see, have become much smaller in relation to just a few hundred years before. This was from the archaic, and now they've gotten to where they're all the way down to this really small, tiny ones. They're much thinner, and that's because the game is changing. What they're going after is changing. And their pottery development is becoming, which you won't be able to see it from that far back, but when you come look at it, it's much thinner. It's just unbelievably intricate. They're developing the bases on them that's very similar to the pottery and the ceramics that we even see today. Their habitats, kind of similar to what we saw during the archaic period, but they're becoming much more permanent and they're becoming larger. So it's more than just one or two people that can fit in the particular house, not really house, but into the hut, I guess is a better word for it. And as I had said earlier, the settlements are going to start becoming larger, but yet they're going to become more separated than they were, as this one shows. And this was just a depiction of how the social sediment and structures were starting to change, and how that they were going to start creating almost like the neighborhoods we see today. And this is just showing on the left, or yeah, my left, the gardening and the horticultural practices that they did. And even this is the first time during this period that we actually see any evidence of dog or canine domestication. And then we get, we get to the Woodland Mound. Now, this is not one that we have in Alabama. The sad thing about what we have determined is we are almost certain that at one time we did have evidence of mounds, or we did have mounds in this part of Alabama. And the reason that we are so sure about that is when you, not too far away into Blakely, you have Kulamoki, which is along a waterway. With the Columbia, over in Columbia, we are almost certain that there was a complex over there, but after farming and industrial practices, they're gone. So we have no mounds left here in this area. But that brings us to the final stage, the Mississippian. It was the most recent before we get to the historical period, and it was from 1000 to 1550 AD. These are your traditional mound builders that most everyone knows about. They are the ones responsible for Moundville, and it's just a stunning complex. If you've never seen it, I would highly recommend it. Here is where we actually have the development of a political and a government system. And the type of political system that operated in the Mississippian time was known as a chiefdom, and is exactly as it sounds. You had the chief who he was a single person that ruled over many. That didn't last, it didn't go well, because we have found that only into about 2 centuries into this era that complete structure it fell apart. And not too long after that, Moundville was deserted. With this particular type of settlement, you're always going to be near a water system, and they have perfected the art of farming. They have now created effigies, which is a stone or a wooden or clay likeness of a person that is deceased, or of one of their deities, one of their gods, that would be buried with them, or even of their ancestors. Let's see, they have developed games during this time. It was a particular game called Chunky, which they would roll a stone disc. I kind of equate it almost to bowling for us. We have found, excuse me, some of the pieces of the game were found up in Moundville, and you can even still see the actual field where they played it is still evident. Let's see. Here, as I was talking about earlier, the important part of this particular period is not necessarily what they created. It was the fact that they are now developing this social awareness that is just beyond having to survive. They are doing things now because it's become a part of their life. The celebration of life, of death, fertility, all of those things that we do today, it stemmed from them. It began during this particular period. Not to say that the other time periods didn't have this awareness of self, but it was where this became important to them. And it wasn't just the notion of having to try to survive and find food. They were actually doing things because it was enjoyable. And let's see, they were processing food. It was, honestly, it wasn't too different from the way that we see things are done with modern day tribes. And this, I was hoping this was on here, shows the huts have the houses actually have gotten bigger. They're large enough. They're one large room, but they are large enough for upwards of 3 to 4 people. And that just shows one of the complexes at its height. Moundville had the capacity for, I believe at its population height was at about 50,000 people. If you can imagine that type of a settlement from where they have gone from being nomads to an entire city. And just some more illustrations showing how the sites were constructed, and then just some of the agricultural practices. And this one over here is actually an accurate rendition of what Moundville would have looked like then. And this decorative disc was found in one of the burial mounds, and I've seen it on display. It was just it was in the chief's burial mound, and it was there just strictly for decorative and to be buried with him. It was just a burial good. There really was no function of it. And the bottom one just shows kind of a model of what daily life would have looked like. Short of the technology that we have, their practices, their ideas, they weren't so different from ours. And that is all. I wasn't expecting to have to be recorded, so I am sorry. But that's just a basic rundown of each of the 4 eras that we study for the prehistory of the Native Americans in North America. And you are welcome to come up and look at, I have representations of stone tools and of the pottery for each of the eras. So you guys are welcome to come up and look at it, and I'll answer any questions, or if you have any questions now, I'll answer any that you may have, if anybody does.
Are the Uchi Indians and the Creek Indians, is that the same?
Could say it again?
We call the Uchi Indians, or the Uchi Indians.
The Creek, yes ma'am, I was gonna say they're Creek. Each of the major 5 tribes, they each have smaller tribes that have kind of sub-tribes, I guess, that you would say. But yes ma'am, they are.
Any artifacts that came from this particular area?
Well, all of these here came from the Wiregrass area, because the exhibit that's going to be happening in November, I wanted to focus on the Wiregrass area because there's nothing here that, nobody has an exhibit that's really detailing what was here in that area. So all of this that is here was found within Henry County, Houston County, Dale County, and Barber County. So as far as now in Russell County, none of it is from that particular area of the Phoenix City area, but there is some at least from Barber.
But there would be evidence of those types of things here.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely there would be, especially along the water. You're going to find them, and I think you and I had talked about that before. There's going to be a lot of, if it hasn't already been picked up, a lot of evidence of it. But yes, in this area too. The entire state has a lot of evidence and artifacts that is still left.
Well, what you have to realize that the water table was a lot higher than that.
Absolutely, it was.
What we would consider near the water right now was actually underwater.
Right, that's true.
So,
What is happening in November?
Oh, in November, the tentative date that we have set right now is November the 19th, and there's going to be an exhibit that is going to be opening at Landmark Park. We are hoping to open it with an actual powwow, an intertribal powwow, that we are going to try to get as many of the tribes that want to come and participate to do between the 19th and the 20th to kind of celebrate the opening of this exhibit, because there'll be 4 different pavilions that'll be set up for Paleo, Archaic, Woodland, and then Mississippian. So that's what we're planning on doing in that weekend. Yes, ma'am.
There's some artifacts in the Columbus Museum that were found in this area. We dug 13 barrels on the Chattahoochee. Oh, it's been 2 or 3 years ago. About in the 70s, I think it was.
Oh, wow.
And we found a 49 bead necklace. We found some spud stones. You don't know what that is. It's polished green
Right.
stone.
That's
And
awesome.
just artifacts, and we did 13 barrels that were washing into the Chattahoochee. And there was a mound down by Brickyard that Hawkins described,
Right.
that you can stand out, but you can just see a little, it's been plowed over so much. But he described it as 25 feet high when he came to the lake. And we excavated around there. That was years ago in the 70s.
Well, I mean, at least you got to it and got to preserve as much of the artifacts as you could, because that's what I was talking about. That's what is so terrible, because in the area, I know we had evidence of it. It's just, it's gone now. And I wish that we had at least just one surviving mound that was still left. But I got called out to one site that on some farmland up in the headland area, and he swore, he said, "It's a mound. I know it's a mound. It's a mound." And if it was, someone had already beat me to it and had taken everything that was in it. And that was the closest thing that I found to see that maybe it could have been a mound. I don't know. I was kind of back and forth between it being natural and being man-made. But this farmer swore that he had grown up being told that it was a mound and that there was artifacts out there, and he wouldn't let anyone touch it, and they wouldn't let him farm over it. But when I got there and we excavated it, there was nothing there. And I think after that they ended up plowing over it. So even I guess since we couldn't find anything, he wasn't satisfied, and he just said, "Forget it, we're going to plow over it." But that's what's ended up happening with everything that we've had in that area. And we've looked, but there's nothing left that we could find. So, anybody else?
Candace, be sure you thank
Oh, no problem. Thank you for having me.